Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance in this rebroadcasting of a recent Crawlspace episode. Lance, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I love it when we make new friends for the show. You know you've made a new friend, even though we're talking about very tragic circumstances here, but you know you've made a new friend when you can go through a technical difficulty, pop out on the other side, and it's a seamless conversation, and that's what happened here. No one will ever know that our recording system shut down and we had to resume this conversation a day later, but it happened, and that's what I'm saying. You know you have a good guest, you know you have a new friend of the show when they're like, yep, sorry, these things happen and I'm fine hopping back on. I'm not even going to change my clothes. I'm going to make sure this goes as seamless as possible. And I can't wait for the listeners to hear his story. But Tim, I can't wait for the listeners to hear your story in regards specifically to your mood. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing great over here. And yes, very excited to introduce this conversation with Mike Gatto. And he is an author, the author of a book called Noir by Necessity, How My Father's Unsolved Murder Took Me to Dark Places. And Mike was an up-and-coming young lawmaker when his father was brutally murdered on November 12th, 2013 in Silver Lake, Los Angeles, California. Joseph Gatto was 78 years old when he was murdered, and the case is still unsolved. And Mike is writing this book because he's asking web sleuths to help with this case.
And Tim, you said that he was an up-and-coming politician, and you're right. He was an accomplished politician. He was on track to perhaps run for governor, mayor. I mean, he might have ended up in Washington at some point. He still might. He's a young guy. He still might. And you know what? If I ever get the opportunity to, I will vote for him. And you can check out everything that he has going on aside from and including his father's murder. He's got a website, MikeGatto.com. That's Mike, Gatto.com. And if you do have any information or any suggestions or anything that might be relevant in regards to his father Joseph's murder, he does encourage people to email him, mike@mikegatto.com.
And a big shout out to Shiloh and Scott of LA Not So Confidential for introducing Mike to us for this interview. They interviewed him on their show, LA Not So Confidential. We were lucky enough to get him here on Crawlspace.
All right, Tim, before you throw it to the conversation with Mike Gatto, I just want to mention to people that CrimeCon is coming up in Denver, Colorado, September 5th to the 7th, and we're going to be there. We're going to be joined by our cardboard cutouts that were there last year, and it's going to be a wonderful reunion of sorts. And if anybody wants to join us as well, and if you want a discount, you can use code Crawlspace to get 10% off your standard pass for CrimeCon 2025 in Denver, Colorado, September 5th through the 7th.
All right. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. We really appreciate it. Please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod. And don't forget to leave comments on Spotify or YouTube. Again, Mike asked for web sleuths' help in this mystery. Okay, everybody, we're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Mike Gatto. Welcome to the podcast, Mike Gatto. How are you today?
Oh, it's good to be here, even though we're talking about a difficult topic.
Yeah, that's the problem that we have with doing these shows is that we have these great guests on. You're a great guest. We're very much looking forward to this, but the topics are always tragic. They're always tragedy related, and yours is no different. And before we started recording, we were expressing our condolences for your loss, and it really is a tremendous loss. But before we get into this, can you introduce yourself to the listeners and maybe a little bit of background on you and what brings you to the show?
Sure. So my name is Mike Gatto, and I'm best known for my career in politics. I was elected to the California State Legislature, and I rose to some of the highest ranks within the California Legislature. At some point, I was the chair of the most powerful committee in the California Legislature. But a lot of people also know me, particularly in California and Los Angeles, because midway during my tenure in the legislature, my father was murdered in a home invasion robbery in a very safe neighborhood of Los Angeles, a neighborhood that I was in my district and I represented and that I grew up in.
And can you tell us a little bit about your dad?
Well, my dad was one of those last Renaissance men. He had devoted much of his life to art. He was an art teacher. He was an artist himself. He was sort of that, I'll say, stereotypical Italian personality where he loved creating things and he was very good with art. But at the same time, he was sort of a throwback too. You know, he could take apart an engine with me. He could rewire a house with me. He knew how to do just about everything, work with his hands. And he also had this great sort of, grumpy old man Italian personality. He'd grow tomatoes, he'd grow peaches, he'd give them to everybody in the neighborhood, everybody loved him. But he also wasn't afraid to tell you, if you said something, oh, that's nonsense, right? So he had this very, I guess, dichotomous personality, or I don't even know if that's the right word, but he was a really, really great guy.
Yeah, you can tell that he was a great guy, even in your expression, if people aren't watching this on YouTube or Spotify, if you're just listening to it. When you're talking about your dad, you have this expression on your face, like not a whole lot of bad memories there. I feel like there's a lot of good memories there. When I was reading about him and looking into you, there's a few really great articles about what happened and a bit about the background of your family. But there's this amazing picture of you and your dad at your wedding. And it's this incredible picture. Can you just go into a little bit more detail about the relationship between you and your dad and, your family dynamic? Because when I saw this picture, I my heart broke.
Well, thank you. So my dad loved, above all things, he loved kids. When I was a kid, it was a little hard because, he was a teacher, right? And he had 3 jobs when I was a kid. He would get up at 5 a.m. He would prepare his lessons plans. He would go teach at high school, an arts high school that he co-founded. And then he would come home, he would change really quickly. And then he had a job at Dodger Stadium, in the concessions selling peanuts. And he'd work until the end of the Dodger game, 10 o'clock at night. And he'd come home and do it all again. And then on Saturday, he had a 3rd job. That was always hard for me as a kid. I understand now, of course, that he was working so hard so that I would have other opportunities. I think as a kid, I was a little jealous of all the other kids he was teaching. But gosh, he loved children. And when I had kids of my own, grandchildren, he became the most doting grandfather. And on top of that, he loved politics, right? He loved politics. And he was so happy and so proud when I got elected. And he was such a force during my campaign that I just felt so lucky to have him.
Can you tell us about the decision to write this book, Noir by Necessity?
Yeah, so the decision to write a book for me did not come easy. Naturally, when you're in politics, there's certain things you should say, and there's certain things you should not say. There's also, many aspects of the crime that I think the public was not aware of. But ultimately, after a lot of reflection and a lot of conversations with my wife, I decided to write the book and decided to, I accepted the publishing deal because I had talked, over the course of time in my father's case, which, of course is still unsolved, I had spoken with so many other victims. And I realized that for whatever reason, I am blessed to have a platform. I have a pretty healthy Twitter following that's pretty, engaged with what I say. I have the ability to go on the nightly news. I'm on the news several times a week, and I have the opportunity to do podcasts like this. And on top of that, there's people who are interested in my dad's story and would buy the book. I wanted to give a little window into the life of what it's like to lose a loved one in a manner like this. You put all the politics aside, right? And there's people out there who think that criminals have it too easy. And there's people out there who think criminals have it too hard. And there's people out there who don't really think about victims. And there's people out there who think victims have it hard. I wanted to provide an unvarnished take on what it's like as a victim, a family member, when your family member gets murdered. When I talk about the book, I talk about this principle, right? Which I call the DMV principle. When I was in office and I was this, powerful state lawmaker and I set the DMV's budget, if I walked into a DMV and they knew who I was and they still treated me like dirt, my principle was, wow, how bad is the public treated? And there are some parts of my dad's case and the investigation, things like that, where it's like, wow, like if that could happen to me as an elected official, and my dad's case is in the news every single day at that time, how is it that just regular victims are treated? And the answer is not very well. And so I wanted to tell their story, and I wanted to make the reader get a little window into what it's like.
It's always a welcome topic on this show when people who have gone through a tragedy like you've gone through come out and they try to help other people and use that to be a tool to make something better out of some terrible, tragic event. But it can't happen immediately. So you learn about your father's death and you start learning about all of the details that go into that specific moment. When did you come out of that and realize I got to try to do something better here?
It took a while. And by the way, I should back up and say that I can't look you in the eye and, look the viewers in the eye and say that I was purely selfless here. I can't say that I wrote the book just to bring attention to other people. That was a major part of it. Part of it also was catharsis, going through the process of trying to process my dad's murder and to share that. And then part of it was also because I frankly hoped that there's a lot of people out there who are into true crime. Many of your listeners, right? They're really into true crime. And there's some brilliant minds out there. And I must confess that I had this fantasy that people would buy my book and they would, page through it. And I try to write everything that I know. And I try to write it as I learned it, literally chronologically. And I had this fantasy that someone would step forward and say, oh, I know exactly who did it. Or even, somebody in Los Angeles would say, wow, my neighbor, came home in a brush of sweat that night, right? Or at the same time, right? So I thought maybe this would also be something that helps solve the crime. Hasn't happened so far.
But you do sort of invite web sleuths to try to piece together the clues to solve the mystery just in your description. Yeah, so can you tell us about the circumstances of your dad's murder?
Sure. So my dad's murder, and again, this is part of the reason why I wrote the book. It is so vexing and so troubling and so mysterious. I'm left, and I know a lot about it, with way more questions still than answers, even though it has been, it'll be 12 years this November. So my dad was found slumped over on the third floor of his own home, sitting at his desk. There were no signs of forced entry. He had died by one gunshot wound that I believe had gone into his abdomen and it never exited it. I think the bullet lodged in his leg or something like that. There was very little taken from the house. There was a wooden file cabinet that was hacked into. There was what I think a show attempt to try to get into some safes. Somebody had made a show of trying to get into safes with yard clippers. I want to paint a picture for the viewers. These were 1860s Wells Fargo bank type safes, old school, that were have the walls this thick of ceramic and iron, right? There's no getting into these safes. And somebody had tried to get into them with yard clippers, right? Very few valuables were taken. And then on top of that, this was the only murder in this neighborhood of Los Angeles in all of 2013. Okay, so that's some of it. That's some of the mysterious stuff. There have been a wide range of theories that came out about my dad's killer. And I talk about this in the book. For the first 5 years, the dominant theory, and it came from a woman in the neighborhood. There was a woman who was driving home the night that the police think my dad was killed. She was driving home from karate with her son, very young boy, right around dinner time. My dad's neighborhood, the Silver Lake neighborhood in Los Angeles, you just got to think of it as a stadium. There's all these different levels and there's some little aisle streets that connect the different levels. So she was driving at one of the higher levels in the stadium bowl and she saw a guy breaking into cars. Now, mind you, this is the time that everybody comes home from work. I guess it was kind of dark, getting dark, but fairly listlessly. And there's a guy just casually breaking into cars, right? Kind of weird. She calls the neighboring guy, hey, neighbor, there's a guy breaking into cars. And they confront him. And the guy runs away. He runs away. Now, the neighbor guy thinks that the guy said something like, turn around unless you want to die tonight, or something like that. So the guy goes running down these walk streets. There's stair streets in this neighborhood that cars can't go down, but people can. And he goes down to another level of the bowl. They chase him. They drive their car around and they go down there and they chase him. At this point, the boy, not the adults, the boy thinks that he brandished a gun. Okay, but nobody else saw his face really or saw the gun. For most of my dad's investigation, the police thought, okay, this guy went down here. This is them talking, not me. He was right-handed. And when people are fleeing and they're right-handed, they turn right. So he turned right, headed towards my dad's street. Then he thought my dad's street was an alley, so he went down my dad's street. My dad was on a small street, 3 houses. At that moment, again, this is the police talking, a tour helicopter was flying to the Hollywood sign, and the flight path was over my dad's house. This guy thought that it was a police helicopter, that the police had been dispatched. Also at that moment, by sheer coincidence, my dad had gone to Costco that night. We know this for a fact. He had bought a printer. We know this for a fact. He had a hatchback. We know this for a fact. He could not get the printer out from his side door. This is speculation. So he opened the garage door and opened the hatchback, got the printer out, and then walked it into the house. As he pressed the garage door button, the guy ducked underneath the garage door and hung out in my dad's garage for about an hour. Again, this is the police talking. This is their theory. And you can see all the things that they had to do to like make this work. The guy sat in my dad's garage for about an hour. Mind you, there are 3 cars present. The guy doesn't know if, the Ukrainian wrestling team lives at my dad's house. He doesn't know if my dad has 5 grown sons or 2 grown sons or a wife. 3 cars present, my dad's driveway, right? The guy sits in my dad's garage for about an hour and then at some point decides to go into an inhabited house and walks up to the 3rd floor and shoots my dad and then leaves, right? Rifles through some stuff, tries to get into a safe, watches my dad die. That's a key component of it. And then leaves. And since then, in the 12 years, doesn't reoffend again, doesn't get arrested, doesn't do anything like that, right? It was so fantastical to me that's part of the reason why I had to share it with the book, because there's so many things, and I'm sure you've been noting, like there's so many things in there that just are they all have to line up for this theory to work.
That's also pretty rare to get a police theory so detailed where you said like everything had to line up and conveniently the Tor helicopter was flying over. And so he conveniently thought that was the police dispatched after him. Again, I'm going to come back to like a time frame. When did they give this to you? Like how long did it take them to come up with this?
The first theory after my dad was killed was that it was the Russian mafia. I'm not making this up.
Wait, their theory?
It was like the media's theory.
Okay.
Because my dad had a collection of these Russian paintings. He was going to give a lecture on them, and it was advertised, Joe Gatto is going to show up with his collection of priceless Russian paintings and give a lecture, and he's going to show some of them. First of all, the paintings weren't priceless. They were worth a few $1,000s each. Second of all, there was a neighbor who kind of talked to the media, and that's what went out first. When we disposed of that theory, I started talking with the detectives, and I was like, my initial thing was, this is about me, right? This is about my politics. 2013 was not as crazy as now, but I was like, I had pissed a lot of people off, and some people had done crazy things. It's so random, but I had spoken up. Well, I don't even want to tell the story, but I had spoken up against what I perceived to be anti-Semitic, and some guys had like splashed fake circumcision blood on stuff near me and stuff like that at protests in my office. So there was some strange people, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, who I was concerned had tried to send me a message. The police poo-pooed that. They said, they would have just killed you. Okay, fair enough. But once this woman stepped forward and she came to the media and then the details came out, the police did focus on this. And I remember being so frustrated because one of the detectives originally said, I don't go looking for no unicorns when there's a horse right in front of me. And it's like, well, the horse you're talking about, he fled when he was faced like a mom and her son, but then decided to shoot my dad. You got to like explain all these timing things and the lack of forced entry by he was just sitting there in the garage waiting to duck under. We know my dad took a while to set up the printer and he sent some emails and all this stuff. And so we know that the timeline, there's about an hour where the guy just sat in the garage, didn't take anything, didn't just press the button and leave. But then he decided to go into an inhabited house, shot my dad, and then watched him die, which is a pretty cold-hearted thing to do. Then rifled through some things, didn't really walk out with much, and then left. If this person was so stupid to try to get into a safe with a yard snipper, this person miraculously has been so smart that they hasn't reoffended, right? And like, there's so many holes in it. I could go on and on, right?
Yeah, a lot of seemingly inconsistencies, I think, with that theory. Would this thief have been chased if he was really waving a gun around?
That was another question that I had. I believe the boy said he saw the gun when they had already given chase. The other question that the people have asked me is, would a person with a gun be breaking into cars, right? A person who has a gun, and let's say the person's desperate for a fix, druggie, they sell the gun. They go down to, a place and they trade the gun and say, give me some drugs. Or they just go hold somebody up. The reservoir in Los Angeles where my dad lived, he lived by a lake, a man-made lake. There's like 10,000 people who go jogging every day and like walk around the lake. And there's people who walk with handbags. And so it's like, if the guy had a gun and was looking for money, he probably would have just stuck somebody up. Maybe, I don't know. It's just weird. You think about also how many car burglars go around packing a gun, because that turns the petty crime where you'll get a slap on the wrist into a major felony. So there's just so many things that are so weird with that theory that I have never really been able to give it that much credibility.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
I don't want to get too graphic, obviously, talking about the murder itself, but what does it say to you with the gunshot wound being in the abdomen?
Yeah, I talked to the police about that quite a bit, and they have given me some perspective on it, and I've tried to process that perspective. Obviously, if this was like a targeted assassination, some very, very professional hitman, they probably would have aimed for the head. Okay, so they have also said it's possible that this was just a spat and some type of accidental killing. Somebody was waving the gun at my dad and it went off. There's so many elements in my dad's house that seem staged that I just can't help but think well, is this just another part that's staged? Shot him in the abdomen and they made sure he was dead. I mean, he was an elderly man, right? So I don't think it takes that much, right? But no, I think that's a very good point. The fact that there was one gunshot in the abdomen as opposed to two in the head probably makes it more likely than not that this was not some kind of crazy assassin, right? Some kind of hired hitman or professional or something like that. Or it could have just been a hired hitman who wasn't that good.
You also said that the bullet didn't go through. It actually got lodged in his leg.
I don't have all the details. My dad's autopsy is still private. But it's my understanding, the police told me that what killed my father was that he bled out. He bled out from the bullet severing his artery in his leg. And that also is part of the part that makes me think about the coldness of this person or the psychopathology or whatever is. I don't know if you guys have ever been to a shooting range, but people are used to seeing guns fired on TV. When a gun's fired in your presence in person, especially without ear protection, especially in an enclosed room, it's really loud. And if you're not a professional, chances are you think the whole world heard it because it's really loud. And again, this idea that this person just shot my dad and waited, it's weird, right? It's just so strange. Especially if the guy was chilling in the garage and could have walked out with my dad's tools or jewelry making equipment or gold or a car. I don't know. There's just so many pieces of this that just don't make sense when I try to mentally profile the killer. I will say one more thing, and I mentioned this in the last chapter of the book. The police, continue to tell me little tidbits, right? And each one is valuable to me. And the whole team, different guys tell me different things, which is kind of weird. But I learned recently that my dad apparently fought back. That he tried to grab the gun, that there was some powder residue on his hands. And of course, that can come from either the gun being, brought right up to him and, or it could come from him grabbing it. Or in theory, right, it could have even been his gun that somebody wrested away from him. But I doubt that, right? The whole thing is just very, very strange.
I don't specialize in bullet trajectories, but that does sound reasonable that your father would have tried to grab the gun and the angle that it goes into him with it being lodged in his leg feels like that's not a straight on shot. It feels like that's almost at a downward angle, right?
Correct. And then, this opens a whole new can of worms, right? For profiling what happened here. My dad never let anybody into his bedroom. I mean, he just didn't, right? He was at the third floor of the house was this big master suite. He was a very private guy. Now he let family in there. He let close friends, if they were having a conversation with him. My dad, his hearing was not perfect, but to me, it's also kind of hard to believe that somebody could open a big garage door to enter the house, walk upstairs. My dad didn't have a dog or anything. He should have. And gotten so far into the room that you could be standing above my dad while he's seated at a chair or get close enough to him that he can wrestle without my dad hearing him. It's all strange. And these are one of those things where, when you examine any moment in time, you notice different abnormalities, but I think a lot of these are relevant to the crime.
Did anyone else have keys to the residence?
Yes. So my sisters, I have two sisters, one older, one younger. Both of them had keys. And I believe my older sister's boyfriend at the time also had keys.
It was one of your sisters that alerted you initially that your father was dead, right?
Correct. My younger sister was the one who discovered my dad's body That must have been obviously very hard on her. She's the one who called me, on that fateful night and told me that she thought my dad was dead or injured or something. I initially couldn't believe it because, the last thing you're thinking about is murder. My dad was very, very, very healthy. But, apparently she went over there to check on him and went into a dark house and found his body.
The reason why she went over there was because she hadn't heard from him, that she was concerned?
Some of this stuff I know and some of this stuff I don't. I was away in Sacramento and I was very busy at the time. But I believe they had regular dinners or dinners scheduled or things like that. And I forget if it was a Tuesday night or Wednesday night or Monday night that they had regular dinners. Like I have dinner with my mom every Sunday night, but they had regular dinner scheduled. And I guess they had one or they didn't. And then she went over there and, she let herself in and found my dad slumped at his chair.
Some of these other, bizarre clues. You mentioned the safe, trying to attempt to open it with garden shears. There's also a gold ring that was left in that office, if I'm not mistaken. What do these things tell you?
I should have also mentioned that when my dad retired, you have to think of my dad as a starving artist who never got to, like nowadays, if you're a starving artist, you just become an actor and, it doesn't matter if I have kids, blah, blah, blah. But my dad's generation, he put off all of his dreams until he retired. But when he retired, he started making jewelry, which was his love. And he actually got success at it, right? And, you start wondering what could have been if he had started earlier. But his pieces were made of gold and silver. They weren't like platinum and diamonds, but they were gold and silver with antiquity sort of blended into them. Very unique. He got some success with it. It is also believed that some of the things that were missing were some of his jewelry that was out in his bedroom / his office. None of the pieces have been found, which again is kind of strange, right? There's sort of an all points bulletin at pawn shops and yeah, you can melt down jewelry pretty easily, but still it is believed without us knowing that some of his jewelry was taken. And they base that on that there were some envelopes that looks like they were rifled through that the thief or the whatever had put on his bed. Again, could be staged, could be not. The weird thing though is my dad did have a very, very big gold like ring, like almost like a wedding ring type thing. And I remember when I toured the crime scene, seeing it right there on his desk. And it's just so strange that things like that were not taken. Electronics were not taken. It strikes me like the whole theory must be wrong. Either the person, was in the house already and my dad came home and surprised the person and the whole timeline is off, or that the crime scene was staged, as we talked about, and it was something vastly bigger, or this person was just really dumb or there for something else, or maybe it was, somebody that my dad knew. I don't know. It's so hard to say. The filing cabinet was also rifled through or attempted to be opened? Yeah. So my dad had a little wooden file cabinet that was about half the size of would go up to about your waist. It had 2 drawers. And that was also something that was very strange, is that file cabinet was hacked into. And as far as we know, the contents were taken. When I toured the crime scene with the police, it was like the file cabinet was mostly empty. Ironically, though, some of the things that were left in it were like some watches and some jewelry. None of anything makes sense. And it's very frustrating. And what about your dad expressing interest in changing his will? Are you up on exactly the changes he was attempting to make? Yeah, I mean, my dad talked with me about these things, and, those conversations are always a little awkward, right? When a parent talks with you about changing a will, you want to be supportive of them, but at the same time, you don't want to look like you're thinking about their death or you're greedy or anything like that. And so I would always express to my dad, you're going to be here for a long time, relax, don't do anything mean, don't do anything that could be interpreted as mean-spirited when you're gone. But my dad was very much into grandchildren. He expressed to me literally a month, 2 months, all the time leading up to right before he was killed, that he wanted to change all of his estate planning to skip a generation. His theory was that I was doing okay, and I was, that my sisters were doing okay, and they were, but he wanted to make sure that the next generation had stuff. So I had 2 kids at the time. My younger sister has 1 kid, and he was just going to leave everything rather than to the 3 kids, to the 3 grandkids. And he was in the process of doing that right before he got killed. And unfortunately, as things ended up, my kids ended up with nothing. They barely even have, a few token mementos from him, because the estate plan that got probated was written before they even existed. And it is what it is.
Wow, that's really frustrating.
It is sad because my oldest daughter had a very good relationship with my dad. She loved art, and he would come visit us, and he would stay at our house in Sacramento. And when we came down to Los Angeles, they would spend hours and hours and hours painting. And I mean, she's a little kid and she's learning watercolor techniques from my dad. And they had a very, very close relationship. And it's just like some of the things that we wanted her to get, like a watercolor set. Loving the fact that she had the artistic gene, something which skipped my generation because I've got no artistic skills at all. But he got very close with her. He was very happy too at the birth of my second child, who he got to hold and got to spend some time with. Of course, the thing that makes me sad is that my father never got a chance to meet my third child, which is my boy, who is named after him. My third-born child is named Joseph in honor of my dad.
This must have come from something that had been instilled in him in his upbringing. I don't know if we've actually talked about his upbringing and where he came from. Can you just give us a little bit of background on, where he comes from?
My dad grew up very, very poor. He was born during the Great Depression. His father was an immigrant from Italy, and his dad came here and he left this verdant little valley that looks like something out of the Tuscan sun. And he came to the United States and he worked underground in a coal mine all day. He got a job offer to, rather than mining the coal himself in Pennsylvania, he got a job offer to shovel coal into a furnace in Colorado. And so he headed to Colorado. And then at some point, I want to say during World War II, he got some kind of position with the Air Force where he built structures that the Air Force would bomb, right? Actually, at that time, it was the Air Corps, not even the Air Force. But that got him to Oakland and eventually to Southern California. And that's how my family made it out here. My dad grew up very, very poor. His dad, pretty common for the time, had a bit of a drinking problem. I used to judge him for that, but now I look back and I say, my God, this guy went from this beautiful, farmland and gentle sun and green trees to working underground all day. So my dad's upbringing was not ideal, but, he rose above it and he became something that was very different from what his father was.
That is quite an interesting career path, going from two different types of coal mining and still having this like artistic inclination, this artistic urge. And you said that once he retired, he was able to pursue that a little bit more. Was that something that was like ultimately like very present in your life when he was raising you?
You could argue that my family, every generation is a reaction, right? So you have my grandfather, who is a coal miner, my dad, who was the artist, and then me as the lawyer politician, right? But I don't think that was intentional. I think my grandfather was a genuine guy who worked with his hands. My father was a genuine artist at his core. And I'm a genuine, I guess they call it a left brain person. That's just the way I am, right? I can't change that. He did try to instill art in me when I was a kid. When I bought Legos, or when I got Legos as a gift, he would throw away the instructions and say, no, you build it. You do something creative with this. You figure it out, right? And he would do little things like that at the time I really hated him for. But now I'm like, that's kind of cool, right? That's kind of a cool way to impart a sense of creativity versus just a sense of following or conforming in me. The sad thing is, though, and I know this disappointed him, is he always wanted me to have the ability to paint or to draw or to sculpt or something like that. But man, if you saw my paintings, they never really rose above the level of like caveman. And it is what it is. I mean, you got to accept who you are.
Hey, don't sell yourself short. I mean, some of those caveman paintings are pretty good. Considering that they didn't have a very big frame of reference.
Yeah. These are really bad, though. Trust me.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Now, focusing on the case a little bit, how do you feel about the investigation into your dad's murder?
Well, I mentally break the investigation down into like 3 phases. There was the first team that was on site, and they had a very daunting challenge. They had this mysterious murder in a very, very big 3-story house where my dad was a collector, right? My dad was somebody who gathered stuff, the pejorative might be pack rat. They worked very, very hard. And then the second phase was, the first detectives that were assigned to the case. And the third phase is the detectives that are assigned now. I think the first and the third phase have gone very well. The second phase was a little more difficult. The first set of detectives that were assigned to the case, they seemed very much confined to their ways. And on top of that, they didn't have a great bedside manner. I'll give a couple examples, and I talk about these in the book. When I went to tour the crime scene, now mind you, I had been up for like 48 hours at this point. I don't know, like a long time. And we had driven, because, like flights with 2 kids and everything like that. We had driven from Sacramento back down to LA. And, I get to LA and the media is surrounding my dad's house and my house. Finally, I get through the cordon of media and I tour the crime scene. And now I'm looking at my child at home. When my dad was found, slumped over. And first conversation they have with me when they pull me aside is to sort of lecture me on politics. That's fair. I mean, I was used to it. When you meet a politician, a lot of people want to take advantage to lobby them at that moment. My wife tells a funny story about when my second child was born. The anesthesiologist was supposed to attend to her, but there was a bill that affected him up in the legislature. And so he was like, oh, like, you're my Gatto? And he started talking with me about the bill. And finally she's like, hey, I need the epidural. And so stuff like that happened all the time. But, it's like you expect police to be a little more professional. The second thing is, by chance, one of them went to high school with a cousin of mine, second cousin, not like, somebody super close. But when he learned that, I guess they had a big rivalry in high school. They hated each other. And he kind of took it out on me, which was like kind of strange. Like, again, you're investigating a murder here. Like, I'm not my cousin. You guys, you guys are in your 50s. Like, come on, high school, right? So the first phase of the investigation was rough. And again, the point I make is I'm a strong guy. I can take it. I was in politics, like no big deal. It rolls off my back. But I just wonder what level of customer service the average person gets in a situation like this. And that makes me feel for them.
This isn't a question. I just want to echo what the listeners are probably thinking right now, is that when you arrived at the scene in the early stages, one officer tried to lobby you politically, not in any way connected to your father's murder, and another one had this high school grudge that was spilling over to you, but it was actually with your second cousin.
Correct. The second cousin grudge came out a few days later. He had looked at my dad's call records and he recognized a very unique Italian last name. And then he's like, oh, by chance, are you related? So that came out a couple of days later. But the political lecturing was the night that I toured the crime scene.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
As far as your dad's will goes, all I can hear in my head is Keith Morrison from Dateline's voice saying, follow the money. Now, have you and your family considered the implications of who could have benefited?
Yes. I mean, it's a very unpleasant thought. The circumstances of my dad's death were so frustrating. And the fact that the crime is still not solved after all these years, I would not be a good son to my father if I did not explore every lead. And if I did not encourage the police to explore every lead and help them as much as I could, right? I mean, it just is so strange when, again, you look at all the things that happened and you realize that, the police's idea of the different suspects, right, is like, a young guy high on drugs, possibly somebody who just wanted to break in and get something. None of these profiles are smart people, right? They're impulsive, rash, desperate. But again, the idea that this person has not reoffended, because, there are some fingerprints, there's some DNA, like it boggles the mind, right? It boggles the mind. And by the way, hasn't talked, right? Because usually if you're some young guy and you do something like this, the very next time you're hanging around with your criminal buddies and you're doing drugs and you're talking and you get into a dispute, it's like, oh no, man, I'm tough. I killed a guy, right? And the fact that nothing, there's no criminals who have talked, there's been no arrest. It does make you sometimes wonder, could there be way more to this story?
What about the gun itself? What sort of ballistics were done on that, and what type of weapon was it?
The police have given me some basic details. They did a full ballistics test and everything like that. They said something to me kind of offhand, like the ammunition was not modern, like they don't think it was purchased that recently. But I mean, again, what does that mean? Could the gun have been stolen? Could the gun have been, taken from some house? Could the gun have been my dad's that someone got and used on him? I doubt it. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. This is just one of the many, many different weird things in my dad's case, right? Because again, if this was like a hitman, a professional hitman, they probably would have used a different gun. And they probably would have shot my father in the head versus the abdomen. However, if somebody was going to great lengths to stage a crime scene, you could see some of the things happening that we discussed earlier. But there could also be a third possibility, right? There could be a third possibility that this was somebody that my dad knew, that this was somebody who owned a gun or whose family owned the gun, and that there was a little bit of passion involved. Maybe this person went and confronted my father about something. Maybe it was about money. Maybe it was about something else. And then the gun went off, or there was some sort of altercation or something like that. So there's so many different possibilities, and I try to go through all of them in the book.
Was there any other indication of a struggle or blood anywhere else? With your father being found behind his desk and slumped over, I think initially my head went to he was already sitting at his desk, but I don't think that was the case, right? Because unless he was shot from somebody standing over him firing down, because then the bullet would get lodged in his leg. But I feel like that whole struggle thing makes more sense. Like he was almost not ambushed, but maybe someone came in that he was at least familiar with enough so there wasn't a breaking and entering situation. And then the gun came out and then there was this struggle. But there's a missing piece there. Like he had to get to his desk.
Yeah, there's so many things about this, and none of this really gelled in my mind until literally I was writing the book. And you asked earlier, like why, all the reasons I did it, and some of it was to process it in my brain. Sometimes I process by writing, and some of these details came out literally in like the 9th year of the investigation, where I was hanging out with one of the detectives, just kind of talking, and I was like, oh, okay. You have to account for all these different disparities, right? The first one is the timeline. My dad either came home. We know his whereabouts. We know that, I forget, it was 6:10 or 6:30. He was at the Costco about 10 minutes away. We know he bought a printer. We have the receipts, all these things. But the problem with that is that, except that he went straight home because there's no other receipts and nothing else that we can discern that he did, the timeline would be such that the person came in with him there in an occupied house, shot him, and then watched him die. If you tweak that timeline a little bit and you say that my dad went somewhere, bought something, but there's no receipt, which is weird. My dad kept all receipts, or just did something, right, in the next couple hours, then it's possible, which I think is way more likely, right, that he came home and the person was already inside and he surprised them, right? And that would explain so much more. And the person had already ransacked a little bit. Because again, that way you don't have this weird thing of a person having a gun go off in an enclosed setting and just hanging out, not thinking the neighbors heard, not thinking the cops were called, sitting there watching somebody die, which I think is weird unless you're a total psychopath, right? There's all these weird things if you just tweak the timeline a little bit. The problem with my dad coming home and surprising somebody who had already done this ransacking would be that my dad was not a stupid person. He comes home, walks up to the 3rd floor, and he sees like his room ransacked. I think he would probably grab a phone, or, he has a cell phone, walk out of the house and call 911. I don't think he'd hang around. So, again, there's all sorts of weird things, but yeah, as far as we know, it's the most likely scenario is that there was some sort of altercation. My dad reached for the gun and tried to redirect it or something, and the person shot him standing over him in some way. Or, the person could have even shot him and then sat him down, which is even weirder, but the police have mentioned that to me. So there's many different possibilities here.
One very frustrating part of your book was hearing the section about how you wanted some of the people involved to take polygraphs. Can you get into that a little bit?
That to me was the toughest part of the investigation. And I really debated whether or not to share it. But then I thought, you know what? This truth has to come out. I mean, I've talked with criminologists, right? One criminologist told me that, like, I forget the statistic, but it was something like in the United States, when a senior citizen is murdered in his or her own home, 99.9% of the time, it's someone he knows. It was something like that. I thought, like, is it possible that somebody around my dad knows something? I'm not saying that somebody around my dad was the person who fired the shot. I just wonder, is it possible that they know something or suspect something that they're not sharing? Let me give a scenario that would be totally blameless. Totally blameless. My dad's best friend told his crappy grandson or crappy nephew that he just came home from Joe Gatto's house and wow, he's so happy because Joe's finally doing his lifelong dream of becoming a jeweler. And he's got gold all over the place. And like, all right, my dad's best friend there didn't pull the trigger, but is it possible that he's not sharing that with the police because of whatever? So I pushed these busy detectives. And mind you, the division that's working on my dad's case for the LAPD is the busiest in the city. These guys work long hours. They're the elite division. They get called on every investigation. And part of what happened with my dad's case is they invested his high profile case, but then the minute something else happened, there's a threat on the chief's life, they got pulled off to that. And the minute something else happened, and this is LA. This happens. Those pulling things happen all the time. But anyway, I pushed these guys. I pushed them and pushed them and pushed them. And I said, you know what? You got to polygraph like 10 people, right? People who knew him best. And at some point they're like, oh, you want polygraphs so bad? You got to go first, you and your wife. And I'm thinking like, okay, sure. My poor little wife, mother of 2 kids, spends all her time in Sacramento. Sure. We'll go first. Right. I mean, you got to lead by example. I thought though, once having gone through it, it was like, they just wanted me to get off their back. And there was another element of this that was very unfortunate because I don't think it was my intent, but they certainly took it as that. You have to understand that at this moment that my dad was killed, I was at the peak of my political power. A lot of people thought that I would go on to become something very high rank in the state or in my region, mayor, governor, whatever. I would go, I was a busy politician representing 500,000 people in the heart of Los Angeles. I would go to 7 different events a day. That was my average. 7 speeches, 7 different events. What people see like during the Iowa caucuses, that's the schedule of a busy politician. Okay. I would see the mayor. I would see council members who oversaw the LAPD at these events. You can't avoid it. And they, being human beings, would come to me and say, Mike, how's your dad's case going? And if I said anything other than, oh, it's all great, it's sunshine and roses, if I said, oh, I just want to do this other thing and this other thing and blah, 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 they would then call the chief of police, who would then call the chief of detectives, who would then push the crap downhill on these guys. And these guys were so upset because they thought that I was tattling on them or like somehow pushing more work to them. But again, I'm just trying to use the resources I have as a son who cares about his dad's case, and also keep the political officials informed in an honest way because that's what they asked me to do.
What's the reaction of the law enforcement officials when they get pushed on by these individuals that, have this influence?
They were not happy. I mean, they were very, very unhappy because, I'm a reasonable person. I know that nobody likes having a boss tell them they got to do something more. But I mean, I'll give you an example, right? The police during the first 3-4 years had this profile of my dad's killer. I told you earlier, the one cop said, well, I don't go looking for no unicorns when there's a horse right there. The profile was, it was the kid breaking into cars, even though if you took any block in LA, there's someone breaking into a car at any time. But they said, all right, the kid breaking into cars. I had to do a lot of investigating myself. So I talked with the 2 people who encountered the kid, and I saw a lot of things interesting in their story that didn't really match up. Like one of them said, he was dressed extremely wealthy. He looked like an Eastern European hitman. That was her words. Right. And so then again, that goes more towards, well, why is somebody dressed really nicely who looks like an Eastern European hitman breaking into cars, making a big show of breaking into cars while people are coming home from work? Kind of weird, right? Their theory was like, no, this is a neighborhood kid high on drugs who grew up in the neighborhood. They emphasize that because the walk street that he fled down is not something you know about unless you're from this community. It's very hard to see. You think it's just an entrance to someone's house. So they're like, oh, no, he grew up in the neighborhood. He knew the neighborhood well. And so I'm like, well, okay, like the neighborhood's really small. There's a big lake. There's maybe a couple hundred houses. Have you looked at the census records? They're publicly available on Google. Have you looked for which households have a 20 to 25-year-old kid living in them? Kind of rare, right? It's a neighborhood of like retirees and single family, like families with young kids and gay couples and things like that, right? So it's like, have you gone to the local high school? There's one local high school. We have a sketch. They had a sketch of this guy. Have you pulled the yearbooks? Have you just looked who resembles the sketch? I had to do that, right? I had to call the principal and say, hey, this is really awkward, but the police think it's a local kid who grew up in the neighborhood. Could you give me the yearbooks for the last 5 years of this age range, right? they did not react well to any type of questions. And, it's like you think about it, right? I was a politician and I was very political. When I called them, I would say, hey, listen, I know you're busy. How's it going on this other case? I know you're so busy. Would you mind if you check out this? You just imagine somebody who's not trained in politics, who's just crying and they're so upset at their relative being killed in another part of Los Angeles. And they're calling the police and like, hey, I heard that the gang down the street is talking about this case. Will you go talk with them? And the police just being like, nope, shut them down, right? And like, again, it broke my heart to see what I went through, because then I wonder what other people go through.
That is wild and tragic. I am sorry that you've had to go through all this. Your book is very good and really interesting. I definitely urge our audience to check it out. What are your goals with the book?
The main one is to tell the story of, a little window of what victims go through when a loved one is murdered. It can really disrupt your life. It can disrupt your mental health, your sleep, your relationships. It can disrupt your political career. It can disrupt anything. The second is to talk a little bit about modern law enforcement techniques and, and things like that, and get people a little window. It's like, it's not all just CSI, and, it's even crimes where there's physical evidence, they're not easily solved. Matter of fact, I speculate in the book, like, is the DNA era, has that reduced the old, gumshoe detective of like knocking on doors and interviewing people? I happened to interview one of my dad's neighbors who said that she heard a gunshot at a vastly different time, which throws a whole loop in the timeline. The police didn't even talk to her. The second goal, of course, was to lay out my dad's case mystery style, but chronological, just the facts. It's an easy to read book. I think it's on the short end. It's not long. So that if there are true crime enthusiasts out there, if there are people who believe in their sleuthing abilities, even if there are DNA experts who can come forward and maybe offer their services, I would like people to do that. I welcome it. I welcome all theories. I talk about some of the people who've called me with some really crazy theories, but at the end of the day, still, I welcome anything that anybody has.
That's amazing. I was actually just going to ask you about the web sleuths and the call to action that you have for your dad's murder. Where do they reach out to if they have been looking into this and they have something that they want to tell you? Where do they reach out?
So I'm a very public person. My website is still up. It's mikegatto.com. You can email me at mike@mikegatto.com. If you want to contact people anonymously, there's just Google the LAPD anonymous tip line. I think it's 1-800-WE-TIP or something like that, but they should Google it. Welcome all tips. Happy to keep them confidential, and I appreciate any ideas that anybody might have.